From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Jeff Whitworth returns to advise you soybean growers on late-season insect activity in your fields. Primary among them, a stem borer, which could lead to lodging problems at harvest time. Jeff will also talk about the merits of controlling soybean podworms and armyworms ahead of bean cutting. Then K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti walks through a basic infield method of estimating grain sorghum yields ahead of harvest. He'll explain how that information can be useful. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Chuck Otte discusses creating landscape habitat to attract songbirds. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. We're glad to have you listening once more. We promised you a visit with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth about what's going on insect-wise in soybeans as we push to that harvest stretch, which is just right ahead of us now. And the fact of the matter is there are more than a few insects at work out there, which Jeff's going to report to us about today. And one of those that we've heard about already, and it's still pressing out there, you say, Jeff, the Dectes stem borer. How prevalent is this?
Good morning, Eric. Glad to be here again. The Dectes stem borer, it's a perpetual, perennial, whatever you want to call it, problem. We've gone over this several times, but just to reiterate quickly, it does not occur in any numbers in the eastern one-third of the state. But in the western two-thirds of the state, it can be a real problem, depending upon the year, especially in probably the western half of the state. The Dectes stem borer, it's a beetle. They call it a longhorn beetle because it has long antennae, relatively small, very mobile, very active, and that's part of the problem. The beetles are out laying eggs from about mid-July until now, until there's no more green in any soybean fields. And I say soybeans, they will also lay eggs in sunflowers because they are native to Kansas, and they were first originally found in sunflowers and transitioned into soybeans. At least the first time we found them was 1985. And now they're more of a problem in soybeans than they are in sunflowers. But they're laying eggs, or they have laid eggs. The eggs hatch. They lay them at the petiole. There can be several petioles with eggs occurring inside of them, and the larvae hatch from the eggs. The larvae then go down the petiole. One of the easy ways to determine the extent of an infestation right now is to go out and look at your field. For those late planted fields that are still green, you'll see a dead stem here or dead petiole there. That's because they're infested with a Dectes larva. And those larvae then, they tunnel their way inside the stem, down to the main stem, all the way to the ground. Right about now, most of them are about at ground level. And right now, there's only one per stem for the most part because they're very cannibalistic or aggressive to each other. They eat each other or kill each other, so you only end up with one just before harvest. The fields that I've looked at in the last 4 or 5 days, the larvae are just starting to girdle the plant. They girdle around the inside or the interior of the stem, in which case that usually doesn't cause a problem unless you get wind.
And then you have lodging potential.
Yes, and then you get wind, and the wind can blow the plant over, and then you can't get it during harvest. Now, a lot of the guys in the last 15 years have learned to plant, a little thicker so that maybe the plants help hold each other up so that they don't fall over, or they broadcast plant, or they've tried different tricks because we don't have any management strategy for them other than get out and look, and if your fields are heavily infested with Dectes, make those the first ones that you harvest just as soon as you can harvest them to get them out of the field before they fall over, because the longer you leave them in the field, the more opportunity there is for a storm to come along like there is for the next few days, and then again towards the middle of next week where those plants can blow over. And once they blow over, it is really difficult to pick them up off the ground. You can do it, but you got to go a lot slower, and it's just much more difficult. So if you can get out there and get them before they fall down, that's the best opportunity to do it.
Is there then, Jeff, before we move on to the next pest problem, a threshold to go by as far as knowing that you do have a widespread problem, so many per row, foot, whatever?
There is not. And there's no treatment threshold, no economic injury level, because they're just out there laying eggs from the middle of July until the middle part of September, as long as there's green in the fields. We've put out insecticide efficacy trials in the past. You can kill them, you can control them, but the problem is you have to do that every 2 weeks for 3 or 4 times, so for 6 or 8 weeks, and it's just not economically feasible to do that. And so because of that, we have not taken the opportunity to develop an economic threshold. There is some work going on, some research going on now looking at host plant resistance, and there is some, but it's going to be several years before it's incorporated into any varieties that can be commercially available. So right now the best opportunity is just go out if your field's still green. If not, if they're already, dropped their leaves, they're probably starting to fall over. So harvest just as soon as you can into those fields that are have the most infestation for the deck-leaf stem borer.
Scout your fields for that and some other pests too, as we'll talk about these. One with the multiple names. It's known by the corn earworm, the sorghum headworm, but in the case of soybeans, the bean podworm. What's the word on it?
Yes, I've gotten several questions about the corn earworm, soybean podworm, whatever you want to call it, especially in the late planted fields, the double crop fields that are still green. Some of them are still setting pods in the R6, 7, 8 range. And there are quite a few right now, quite a few fall armyworms, corn earworms, and as you know, we've had a lot of armyworms in the past month or two in a lot of different crops. The armyworm itself probably won't bother soybeans as much, but fall armyworms, corn earworms, yellow-striped armyworms, some of those do. So as long as the pods are green, as long as the plant's still setting green pods and the seeds inside the pods are filling, they're vulnerable to corn earworms or fall armyworms, and they'll feed right on that seed. And that's where you can get a lot of yield loss very quickly. As a matter of fact, the treatment threshold is about 1 per row foot, and you want to catch them while they're small, or while they're, maybe I shouldn't say real small because they're really tough to find when they're real small, but when they're, say, half an inch to an inch long, they still have another week's feeding to do because they do the majority of the damage towards the end of their larval cycle. So once they become half an inch to an inch long, you want to get out and check it. And if you have 1 per row foot and your plants are in the R8, R9 stage and they're still, the seeds are still filling, you might want to consider treating. The problem with that is you want to make dang sure you use enough carrier or water to penetrate the canopy. The insecticides that we use right now are all contact insecticides, so the insect has to contact the insecticide. That's not so bad if you wait till they're middle to late instar larvae because they will be up feeding on the pods. Earlier on, the young larvae, they may be down in the canopy feeding on the leaf tissue, so you don't lots of times get as good a kill, and then they grow up and start feeding on the pods, and you start complaining the insecticide didn't work. So it's a matter of timing and getting enough carrier to get the insecticide down to where the insects are feeding.
Same chemistry, though, to control both the podworm and these armyworms, then?
Yes, the same chemistry will work with fall armyworms, corn earworms, any of these that are actually feeding on the pods. And, a lot of questions about all the armyworms, fall armyworms, beet armyworms, yellow-striped armyworms we've had this year. I don't think they're going to go away. Right now, this week, we're in kind of a lull because from what I've seen, a lot of them are in the pupation stage. That means they're down in the soil or under the leaf litter. They're pupating, so they're not feeding. They'll probably do that for another 5 or 6 days, and then the moths will come out and they'll fly around, they'll mate, and they'll start laying eggs. And that's when the wheat usually starts to germinate in a couple of weeks. Hopefully, you're holding off planting your wheat as late as possible. That's our recommendation from a pest management standpoint, at least. So right now we're in a lull, probably for another 10 days. Then the eggs will start hatching, and we'll start seeing these little tiny small larvae. That's when, if your wheat is germinating, you need to get out and look and sample and monitor the wheat for the little small armyworms, fall armyworms. Catch them while they're small, and if you have to, at that time, to treat them before they actually can reduce the stand or cause any problems. They are really small. They hide during the day, so it sounds like it's an easy thing to do, but you really got to get out. You got to pay attention. And basically, if you look for window painting on the new leaves that are coming out from the wheat, that's usually the easiest way. And then dig in the soil, you'll find the little tiny worms, hiding right around the plants. But you need to get onto it quickly. They're not going to go away until we get temperatures down into the mid-20s. Now, I don't know when that's going to be, but we have seen them feeding on wheat until the first part of November, depending upon the year. So the weather's not going to help us until it gets cold enough down to the mid-20s at night, and then that will stop the armyworms feeding in the wheat.
Producers, soybean growers, get out there, see what's happening in your fields, determine if some sort of insecticide response is warranted given the pest that's out there and its magnitude. And Jeff, we appreciate you staying on top of all of this. Thanks for the latest report. We'll talk again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you, Eric.
Jeff Whitworth, crop entomologist, K-State Research and Extension. And we'll be back shortly with more here on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and for you grain sorghum producers now, we'll glance to a fairly straightforward method of estimating your grain sorghum yields pre-harvest. Now, we have about 11% of the crop harvested in the state or thereabouts, according to the USDA. Most of it is still in the field. And so Ignacio Ciampitti joins us, crop production and cropping systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension, to talk about this formula for gauging grain sorghum yield potential. Ignacio.
Yeah, as always, Eric, thanks for the invitation. So we need to get as close as possible, for sure, after flowering, after blooming, so to make sure that we have all the grains already formed on the panicle, so that gives us a good idea or estimation of overall proximity to harvest. Then we will be a little more accurate on making sure that we get a good prediction on that.
Right. And the basic question here, Ignacio, why would one want to conduct an estimate at this time? Does it have to do with prioritizing one's harvest in as far as the potential that's out there?
Yes, I think that in sorghum, even more relevant, I think that in many other crops, we are seeing already in some situations plants that they are mature. One of the challenges for sorghum is potentially the dry down conditions, precipitation, temperature, all that influence, the time that will take for that plant to go to maturity to harvest. But the key factor, as we always mention, is like scouting, going out, looking at the fields, and making sure that we are looking at the different sections of the field. There are some situations, as we basically have seen in the past, where if the stalks are not heavy and if they are not really well standing, so we have situations of the plant might be experiencing lodging in many places of the field. Mm-hmm. Make sure that you take a look to the standability, the health of your crop, and at the same time you just start making some potential estimations of your overall yield.
Right to that on-farm approach for estimating sorghum yields. It really is a step-by-step process, is it not, Ignacio?
Yeah, exactly. We usually go from the idea of, similar to what we do in other crops, likely what we do in corn. You first look at the number of plants. In this case, since we have also the effect of tillering in sorghum, we have some heads and panicles that they can come not only from one plant, but in fact we have some plants that they can produce more than one panicle because of tillers. it's better just to go straight to counting the number of heads, the total number of heads. The way that we get to this calculation is we look at the heads per unit area. So we look at the number of heads per plant and then the number of plants per acre. So those are the two main components that we basically the first step. And then we use a similar approach as we do it for corn. We look at a section of the field. If we are working on 30-inch row spacing, we tend to focus on 17.4 foot length within a row. And the idea is that within that section, that is 1 of 1,000 of an acre, we start counting how many heads we have in that section. So if we are looking at row spacing that they are different, 15-inch or 7.5, we keep the same length. In 15-inch, we count 2 rows. In 7.5-inch, we count 4 rows. But always keeping the same length of row. To give us an idea, for example, if we go to this area, assuming that we have 30-inch row spacing, and we count 50 heads, so we know that we have close to 50,000, basically, heads per acre. As I mentioned before, this could come from 1 head per plant, or in some situations you might see 2 or 3 heads, basically, because they might be tillers, a contribution on the tillering side. We also need to start counting a good size of heads. I mean, if you are seeing, and this could happen more often in sorghum that is not uniform, if you have situations where the head size or the length, the height is very small, like less than 3 inches, in those situations we try to avoid counting those small heads because the overall contribution to yield on the size of those heads is very minimum. So we try to count the heads that they have much larger size and make sure that when we are doing the count, since this number will be affecting the estimation, we want to make sure that we try to avoid the idea of inflating the yield estimation from this step on the process.
Right. And then the next step is probably the most difficult number to get at, and that is once you have the number of heads per the unit area, then how many seeds are in each head? How does one practically go about that, Ignacio?
Well, that's always a good question, and we are still working on this. I mean, we have developed in the past like a small application that you can take a picture and get a quick estimation. In many situations, when you look at a head, the total number of grains within the head could go from 100 to 5,000. In a yield target of 200 bushel, we probably are closer to 4,000 seeds. If you're in a very dry environment with a lower yield target, right, then you are probably less than 1,000. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to look at the method and trying to connect to the growing conditions. If we are in a growing condition that is really good, most likely, if you look at the size of the heads and your target yield is 150 bushels, we'll probably go with between 2,000, 3,000 grains per head. So we usually say we can use around 2,500 as a good number. If we are in a drought condition or drought scenario after flowering for sorghum, then in those situations, if we're expecting yields below 100 bushels, so our target for seeds per head could be between, I would say, 500 and 1,000. So we usually go with 1,000 as a number. Mm-hmm. And so far, this is by far the best way to estimate it. We are hoping that next year we will be ready to launch this application that will be helping us by taking a picture and basically getting the calculations, or at least a fair estimate on the grain number.
Looking forward to that application as you've been working on that for a time, but not here quite yet. So one needs to go through this exercise, and the next entry in it is, again, something that may be hard to get at, the seed weight itself. Once more, is there an easy way to develop that number?
Yes. I mean, compared to the complexity of the estimation for seeds per head, we usually are seeing that in overall we have a little bit variability, but not a lot of variability on the seed weight and the different yield levels. So if you look at the information on seed weight under very different yield levels, in many situations we are seeing that it's very flat. So it's an interesting point because we know that then we have less variability on that factor. So we have, I think that put a table on the article that we are looking at the different yield estimates, and you will see that if we are in a lower yield estimate, the number of seeds per pound is basically much higher than if we are in a high yield estimate, because those seeds are basically smaller in weight. We usually talk about 18,000 seeds per pound or 19,000 seeds per pound, so when the seeds are very low weight. And then as we are improving yields, that number tends to get closer to 17,000 seeds per pound. In that situation, we are expecting to see heavy seeds and then hopefully much better contribution to yield. And since it's a factor that is fairly unknown because we are doing this before the seed weight is finally realized at the end of the season, so we try to use these two numbers as 18 or 19,000 situations under stress, and then in a good growing conditions, if we have good precipitation and temperatures during the grain filling, we tend to use the 17,000 as a really, really good condition, excellent situation for grain filling. And then we do is that we just get basically the total number of heads in that section. We multiply the number of seeds per head, and then we look at the seeds per pound. And then the main goal is that we get estimates on basically what is the overall bushels per acre by just adjusting this information by the pounds per bushel in sorghum. That usually is 56 pounds is a bushel on sorghum.
It's a pretty manageable calculation, let's put it that way, and we're going to direct folks to that article that you put together on this in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter dated the 16th of September. That will give you some examples of how to go about this calculation. But again, Ignacio, you think it's worth a producer's while to make such an estimation ahead of harvest, to have a handle on what is happening or likely to happen once those combines roll?
Yes. We have seen already some situations. The last week of stress condition of high temperature, it might get impacted some of the fields and the crops, and then we need to start looking at this approach of going out and taking a look to the crops to start looking at how to prioritize harvesting time and looking at what fields they might need to harvest first.
Again, agronomy.ksu.edu, the E-Update series, the entry on September the 16th. Grain Sorghum Yield Potential and On-Farm Calculation is the title of that article. Always good to visit, especially at this time of the year, Ignacio, when you yourself are involved with harvest activity in your research. So we appreciate you setting aside this time to visit with us right here. Many thanks.
Thank you, Eric.
That's Ignacio Ciampitti, crop production, cropping systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension. We'll return with more on Agriculture Today. Now in its 97th year of service to agriculture here in Kansas and the Central Plains, this is the K-State Radio Network, and you're listening to Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, moving on now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the USDA is directing billions of dollars to prevent the spread of African swine fever, bolster disaster programs in response to drought, hurting cattle producers, and farmers facing market disruptions. The agency announced yesterday plans to tap funds from the Commodity Credit Corporation as part of what the USDA is calling a comprehensive investment package. The $3 billion package aimed at supporting drought resilience and response, animal disease prevention, market disruption relief, and purchase of food for school nutrition programs. In addition, the USDA announced the launch of a Climate Smart Partnership Initiative to finance what USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack called in a speech yesterday the production of climate-smart commodities through a series of large-scale pilot projects and demonstrations, the agency seeking public comment on that program by November the 1st. And the USDA is designating $500 million through the CCC to support drought recovery and encourage the adoption of water-smart management practices. Specifically, the USDA is planning to designate $500 million to prevent the spread of African swine fever. This by expanding and coordinating the monitoring, surveillance, prevention, quarantine, and eradication activities through the department's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. The USDA's Gary Crawford has more on this.
African swine fever is currently in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and experts agree if it were to show up in the U.S. swine population, it would cost billions of dollars in lost production, sales, export, trade, and U.S. jobs. And so
it is critical to keep this disease out of our country.
And Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack told an audience at Colorado State University Wednesday he's putting more resources into keeping ASF out of the U.S., instructing his staff to get to work with the Office of Management and Budget and others
to transfer up to as much as $500 million of funds from the Commodity Credit Corporation to prevent the spread of African swine fever.
The extra money to be used
to support a robust expansion and coordination of monitoring, surveillance, prevention, quarantining, and other activities in the Dominican Republic and Haiti to help eliminate the risk, while also shoring up our efforts here in the U.S.
to keep the disease out, protect the U.S. pork industry,
and the jobs connected to it.
Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And again, the USDA will provide $500 million in relief for agricultural market disruptions, this including increased transportation challenges, availability and cost of certain materials, and other issues with marketing and distribution of certain commodities. Well, in about 20 minutes from now, the USDA's September 1st grain stocks and small grains annual summary reports are due out. Those will get a lot of attention. The department currently estimating U.S. ending corn stocks at 1.18 billion bushels in 2021. For this grain stocks report, the department surveyed 62,500 farm operations and 8,400 commercial grain storage facilities in an effort to take inventory of actual corn and soybean supplies. Now, Dow Jones' survey of analysts expects that the USDA will find 1.16 billion bushels of corn on hand as of September the 1st. If so, it would be the lowest ending stocks in 8 years. For soybeans, Dow Jones' survey expects USDA to find 172 million bushels on hand as of September 1. That's a little less than the USDA's current estimate of 175 million bushels. And the Dow Jones survey anticipates USDA to find 1.85 billion bushels of wheat on hand as of the first of the month, down from 2.15 billion a year ago. And as to that USDA's small grains annual summary, it's based on information gathered from over 62,000 producer surveys and from objective yield data in sample plots in 10 states. This year, when the drought was so extensive through the northern and northwestern plains, the survey is getting added attention because it'll provide the USDA its first estimate of how many wheat acres were abandoned. Overall, Dow Jones survey expects the USDA's estimate of all wheat production to drop from 1.69 billion bushels to 1.68 billion bushels. That would still be the lowest in 19 years. Again, those numbers out at 11 o'clock. And they will obviously be fodder for discussion in our grain market segment with K-State's Dan O'Brien tomorrow here. Coming your way now, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update with Greg Akagi. Greg?
Donnell Rehagen is joining us. He is the CEO of the National Biodiesel Board. And Donnell, it's a big announcement made by NBB about a name change that's going to take place.
About 2 weeks ago, we made the announcement to all of our members that we are in the process of changing our name, and that new name will be the Clean Fuels Alliance America.
Why did you feel like you needed to rebrand MBB to the Clean Fuels Alliance America?
Our board's been talking about this since in 2020 we launched a brand new vision for our industry. And in that vision, we were specific about trying to raise volumes from a 3 billion gallon industry to a 6 billion gallon industry. And we said we would do that by using biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel. All three of those products would make up 6 billion gallons. And so since then, the board's been talking about the name change that might better reflect that the broadness of all of those fuels.
And people might forget, though, this isn't the first time that the organization has rebranded itself too.
Back in 1994, after we were only 2 years as an organization, that board at that time decided to change its name from the National Soy Diesel Development Board to the National Biodiesel Board, and we've been that ever since. And they did that at that time for the same reason we're doing this now, was just a broadening at that time of feedstocks that might go into biodiesel production versus just maybe soybean oil.
So, Donnell, what work is going to be done in getting that information out and working on the rebranding effort to Clean Fuels Alliance America?
When our board made the decision and took the vote back in August and affirmative to change the name, I congratulated them. I said, great, we've completed step one of about 10. And so, of course, we're going to be bringing on a branding firm who will help us through some of the things like logo development and colors and templates and all those kinds of things. There's also a legal element of changing a lot of paperwork and documents that have established the National Biodiesel Board over the years.
It sounds like it's excited not only your board, but hopefully, obviously, across the industry, too.
I think so, and we certainly hope so. It's a wonderful time for our industry. Lots of demand for our products, and we can see this demand going forward. Our vision for 6 billion gallons is certainly on target, and we want to take advantage of this opportunity to grow this entire industry and return some value to the soybean farmers that founded this industry so many years ago.
Donnell, I appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Greg.
That is Donnell Rehagen, the CEO of the National Biodiesel Board, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And you're tuned to Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today is back now, and we are around to our weekly horticulture segment. Once more, advance on one of those K-State Garden Hour webinars. Yes, they're still going on as we're moving into fall, and the next edition is this coming Wednesday, October the 6th. It will be on a popular topic and then some, and that is how to attract songbirds to your backyard setting. And an individual who is a lifelong bird enthusiast, as well as an extension agricultural agent, will be carrying on this program. Chuck Otte is with us once more. And Chuck, this is right up your alley, right?
It's something that's near and dear to my heart, and I've been dealing with for about 50 years now.
Do want to have you share, if you would, a few of the principles of backyard bird habitat management that you endorse.
Well, it starts with having some decent landscaping. When people occasionally call me and say, I've got no birds at my bird feeder, I go look at their backyard. It's a brand new house. There's no trees. There's no shrubs. There's not even a fence. There's a lawn that's planted. So just some careful placement of trees and shrubs can make your yard a lot more attractive to the birds and to all wildlife in general. Beyond that, it's the basic thing of that I think any restaurant would tell you is this, what they need for success. Give them what they want and give it to them how they want it. So different birds have different preferences, if you will. Some like to feed on the ground. Some like to feed on hanging feeders. And the kind of birds that are in each one of those locations have different food preferences. So if you put the wrong feed in the wrong feeder, they're just going to throw it out on the ground, which is one of those common complaints I get from homeowners. I'm putting this bird mix in, and the blue jays, the cardinals, are just throwing it all on the ground. So we'll talk about what does each species really want, and then where do they want it. So just give them good quality food where they want it.
There are guidelines out there, maybe at the commercial outlet and, well, extension for sure, on the type of feed to select for the given birds you're trying to draw in, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest pitfalls that a lot of backyard bird feeders make is they buy a cheaper, if you will, less expensive bird mix that may have a lot of grain in it, and then put it in the feeder where you've got cardinals, you've got things coming in there that want black oil sunflower seeds. I tell people, buy black oil sunflower seeds. Wherever you put it, the birds are going to eat it. It's the number one most desired food by virtually all bird species.
It's not exotic, that feed, but such a cross-section of birds find favor with that.
Absolutely. And so do the raccoons, so do the possums, so do the rabbits. So, just about everything loves black oil sunflower seeds. It's high oil, it's high protein. And as we head into the colder weather, that's what these critters are really going to need. They need the energy, they need the protein to keep going through the cold weather.
Chuck, while we're on this track, suet cakes are commonly sold. Those are designated for a few specific species, aren't they?
Absolutely. The colder it gets, the more species will utilize it. But for the most part, woodpeckers, nuthatches, it's high fat, it's high energy. So it's just right in the liking. It's easy to feed. It's not that expensive. Got a few bird seeds in there too. So suet is always very popular and a way to bring in something else that may not be hitting your other bird feeders.
Conversely, if you want to go the other direction, feed size-wise, thistle seed is perfect for certain birds.
Thistle seed is really popular with the small goldfinches, the wild canaries, whatever you want to call them. Goldfinches, pine siskins, they really like that little seed. You've got to watch it. You want to make sure you've got fresh thistle seed because it does go rancid very quickly. If you've got any left in May, dump it on the ground because it's going to be bad by October when you start feeding again. An alternative to thistle seed is just getting the sunflower chips. They're pre-shelled. They're often broken up. It's a little bit cheaper, and they don't go rancid nearly as bad. But, yeah, absolutely. You can use specialized feeders of all kinds to bring in certain birds.
In day-to-day management, so much focus is on the type of feed stuff provided to birds. Equally important, the water resource available, right?
Absolutely. I think we've seen it this year especially. We've had some dry weather at times. And as you get into winter, sometimes it's not just is there availability of water, is there availability of liquid water. Having a bird bath heater in a bird bath keeps that water open. Often we'll bring in birds that won't come in otherwise, things like cedar waxwings and bluebirds and robins. They're not going to eat at a lot of our seed feeders, but if you have open water, you can really bring them in.
Want to, before we give details on the webinar upcoming, circle back to that preferred habitat and creating that in your backyard. Here we are in fall, great time to plant ornamentals, and one can design quite specifically to attract birds in.
Absolutely, and think about evergreens. Evergreens provide cover and protection, not only from the weather, but from predators, be it hawks or cats. Any shrub that has lots of fine branches, lilac, spirea. Roughleaf dogwood is a native species that tends to run. I don't want to put that in a small lot, but small things like that work very well. And then if you've got the room, start planting some oaks, some northern red oaks, excellent wildlife trees.
There's a mountain of information on habitat for backyard birds, on feeding them, on watering them, on managing to help them enjoy their stay in the backyard through your extension office. But Chuck, you'll be availing yourself to answer folks' questions about enticing backyard birds at this forthcoming webinar. How to take part in that.
Yeah, and I totally love answering those questions because I know everything's getting taken care of, and we'll have people moderating, and we'll have people put in their questions on the chat line. You can get signed up, and you'll get the Zoom link so that you can participate in this. We have a lot of fun. I think that learning should be fun, so we'll cover a lot of stuff that you and I have just talked about in more detail and a lot of things that we don't have time to address today, but it's going to be a lot of fun. I encourage people to tune in and listen in.
It is set to take place this coming Wednesday, the 6th of October, and it's very easy to find out more about logging into this webinar. It is as easy as searching for K-State Garden Hour. That'll take you right to the links for signing up for this. It's a great series, and Chuck, we appreciate you previewing it with us today. Thank you so much.
Always fun to be with you, Eric.
Chuck Otte, Extension Agricultural Agent for Geary County, and once more, he is very much an authority on birds. He will be sharing his guidelines and his suggestions on enticing backyard birds to the home setting at that Garden Hour coming up this Wednesday. Go to K-State Garden Hour to enroll. That's this week's horticulture segment, bringing this Thursday edition to a close. Thanks, as always, for being along with us. Please rejoin us right here tomorrow, if you would. Meantime, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.